Well, good morning, Nick.
Morning, Matt. Good to see you.
Good to see you, and welcome to all those who are watching watching us micro influencers here at Vogue Academy Talk. In fact, I don't even know what the next level up. It's not macro,
We're nano
nano.
influencers.
All right, we're on our way to becoming nano influencers, but we're just micro at this point. We're gonna
Oh, the next.
yeah. By the next video will be nano.
Okay.
We're gonna beat this joke as long as possible, I think, because it is so
I think
amusing.
nano is smaller than micro. I
Oh,
think we're going
nano.
the
All
other
right, so
direction.
we're
Right.
already nano, we're micro, but what's after micro?
Influencer. Then there's mega or macro, maybe
Mega,
macro, and then
macro.
mega.
Right. Then there's all powerful, I guess.
Mm,
You become a deity, become
yeah, I like
deified.
it.
Yeah, we could be. Who knows? I don't want to aspire that high. We'll stay humble.
Micro is good enough for me.
Micro, you're right. Anyway, okay, so here we are. We had a great discussion last week on critical thinking. I really thought that was I really enjoyed that. And this week we have another great topic, which is insight. And how do we even, we want insights. How do they come about? How do we distinguish it from other types of thinking and reasoning? So to kick us off, Nick has done more research on this than I have. And right before we started talking, you were actually giving some really good distinctions. So I hand it over to you, Nick. Kick us off here.
Yeah. So let me take a little bit of backdrop and why this topic appealed to me, why I proposed it to Matt. One is that, and we've explored the transformational logic and creative problem solving, and insight overlaps with that. It can even be, I think that problem solving could be understood as often an insightful process, a process that requires or evokes insight. And I was curious to kind of have Matt thought about the relationships. That's one angle. Another angle is I was actually exploring the topic of intuition. It came up in a little mini research project that I was doing, but I hadn't ever read the literature on that. And I still haven't, but I found this researcher named Gary Klein who studies intuition in a kind of unconventional way. And then that led me to another book that he's written. It's called Seeing What Others Don't. The remarkable ways we gain insights. Again, Gary Klein. And the title really appealed to me, Seeing What Others Don't. There's an element of that's what mystics do. They see through the appearances to something else. And so I picked up the book and started reading it, and found out a few interesting things. So Klein and his team, he has a couple different companies that he's done. He's not a research psychologist in a university, which I think is really interesting. He has a consulting firm, but he does do empirical work, and then he translates that to practice. And his methodology counters, as does his explanations of intuition, and insight from conventional models. So what he does, he says, the very idea of studying insight intuition in the conventional way in a research university where students are subjects and experiments distorts what you can find, because students as novices are not experts in the domain. So you can't really say much about what experts do. So what's an expert? Someone with lots of knowledge, lots of experience, certainly conscious knowledge, but also other kinds of knowledge. And so if you want to know how experts make insights, then that has a very limited applicability. And so as he's a kind of organizational psychologist, he consults with firms, and he's saying, look, how do organizations improve? And he says one way is they reduce errors and uncertainty, and that's usually the focus. But another way is they gain insight, they gain knowledge, they understand dynamic systems, how things are working. And this requires very different processes than reducing errors. It requires a kind of, I guess he does use the word creativity, making kinds of connections, seeing gaps. And he talks about this as insight as a discontinuous leap in understanding that reframes or leads to a reframing or a different story about how a system or reality is working. And so maybe echoes the term paradigm shift that we talked about with the discussion of Kuhn. So it's a qualitative, discontinuous, quantum change in how we understand something. This really appeals to me. I think it's definitely connected to creative problem solving. And so it's grounded in a kind of in an empiricism, observation, naturalistic versus experimental. So I don't want to get too far into the methodology, but I think what the methodology is unconventional, and then the insights and analysis are unconventional, and those are not separate. And it really hinges or pivots around, if you want to study experts in real situations, you can't put them in a lab. That's not the real situation. So, so then he's methodical, systematic in analyzing, therefore, his naturalistic observations. This is some patterns about what insights are and how they work and why they're important. And as I was reading this, I thought, number one, that this echoes a lot of our language. For my purposes, it really gave some words and some ways of thinking that I hadn't really thought of, but resonated with me. They confirmed some of my observations. And then I noticed he says some things like, well, organizations they underestimate the importance of insights because they're seeking perfection and they're protective and defensive. And I'm like, that sounds how we're thinking about individuals, right? Defensive, protective, maintaining, risk avoidant, aversive, not questioning fundamental beliefs. He calls them anchoring beliefs. Even uses the term core beliefs, which in the studies of individuals often talk about core beliefs of an individual. In his language, he's talking about core beliefs of the institution. And so there's this relationship that he's getting at, but I think from our angle, perhaps he's not examining as much as he might, which is, well, individuals make insights. They're in organizations. They make insights about organizations, and they have to maybe get the organization to understand and accept it, which is other people. But there is this relationship between the subjective experience of the individual making an insight and why they don't, and then how that insight ramifies and is applied in the context. And I thought, oh, there's an element, a strata of what's going on in this process that I think we're particularly sensitive to, right? We're aware of, like, okay, why are people defensive? Why are they protective? What's going on here? To what extent is that protecting a sense of self? And he's talking in very much parallel terms, but he's not using the individual human being, I think, as the unit of analysis when he's doing so. So that resonated with me, and I was kind of curious, hey, how do we think about it? And I'm curious about how you would think about it.
Yeah, I was curious. That's a really interesting move. And it's really common, I think, that when you really should be looking at the individual in terms of fear-based responses, I don't know, it just seems like there is this pattern that he falls into that is common out there, where you instantly generalize it to an organizational level. I just find that really interesting that people do that. I don't know why. Is it, like you're deflecting the deflection or something, like we deflect, or a fear-based response makes us hold on to a certain pattern because that's familiar. We've invested a lot into that. The idea of kind of opening yourself up to new insights or new, like, revelations is frightening, because who knows what's on the other side of that. But to do that on the organizational level, I understand. But it's like individuals are what perpetuate an organization. So I just find it really interesting that people, I don't know, I know,
Yeah.
yeah.
In this case, I understand. I mean, I think there's a larger pattern, which I think we've talked about a few times, which I'll mention. In this case, I understand it. Well, he consults with organizations,
Sure.
and there's
Right.
probably a conventional kind of input. I mean, I could imagine it hard sell to say, well, your corporation or your ability for your R&D team to make advancements is connected to your self-protective strategies for your self-worth. And I could see that with the people like, what? That's not what we're talking about. Like, what do you mean? What is the
Right.
intervention? And so that might be shaped. Like, well, it's not that there aren't organizational interventions you might make. There are some. but they think they maybe indirectly address the individual thinker and team, for instance. But I think my sense is, what I've noticed is there's a disciplinary or epistemological dilemma that people solve in a very simple way. They say the situation, the causes, the conditions, the circumstances, that's what determines action. And they kind of fairly singularly look at that dimension.
So
And then there's other people who say,
can you say that one more time? I just want to make sure I get it.
so there's a kind of epistemological or framework which says, well, human action is determined largely by circumstances, conditions, context, culture,
Yep.
community,
I think that's right.
these things. And then other people say, take the individual's unit of analysis, they're emphasizing autonomy, agency, self-determination, awareness, metacognition. So these are features of the individual. And I think is a really common desire to kind of pick one or the other and to emphasize that. And if from a research point of view, that is a legitimate aim. You could say, I'm going to go as deeply as I can into this to try to understand the individual or the group. However, I think and I've talked about this before, like that's how you get published. You go deeper and deeper into this paradigm. But I think if you actually ask people and they say, well, let's zoom out. Are you saying there's only individuals or there's only social or communal? They would say no. Okay, so when you get into what we're interested in is, well, how do people operate in the world? The real challenge is, what are the kinds of relationships between the individual, the situation, and the context? Like, that's the dilemma. That's what we have to face. I think both parties have made a strong case that the social, the contextual, and etc. are powerful, and the power of the individual and autonomy and choice and creative problem solving. And okay, it's not choosing one or the other. That's too easy.
Right.
That's too simple. And inaccurate. Much messier and harder is to say, how do these things interact? What's the relationship in any given situation? So, and I think, from my point of view, when I'm coaching or working with students, I'm like, okay, how does the social situation, the context, the institutional context, work against your interests and your goals and aims? You need to account for that and work against it. How does it work for you? How could you gain the benefit? Right. So this is real. It's powerful. It's institutive of your thinking and the things you're facing, but that approach assumes that you have autonomy and agency and critical thinking. Like right there, it's obviously right there. If you believe that people can change their behavior in the face of unhelpful or help in conjunction with tailwinds and beneficial, then you're saying, but not fully appreciating, it seems to me, the power of the individual. And I think that's the real challenge. How do we figure out the relationship? And I think then these positions also become quite ideological. Like, if you believe in the power of the individual, then this is your political position, or you're blaming the victim or something like that. If you recognize the power of the context, community, culture, then you're diminishing. You're not a human. You're not a humanist. You're not recognizing the value and dignity of the individual. Okay, for my purposes, as a kind of a social psychologist, at least that lens, I'm like, well, that's just not going to help people solve problems in the world, which is, I'm fundamentally practical. So that was a long disquisition on my particular theory. But I think, again, coming back to your question, like, so why is he not recognizing the individual? I think one could just be practical. Like, it sounds like therapy. If you go into an organization and you're a consultant, and you're talking about people's self-concept and protecting and defending and worth, I think that would maybe not land very well. And then there's this other place where people, I think, are making a simplistic decision to focus on one over the other, social versus individual.
Right. Okay. No, that's helpful. Yeah, I think I would be inclined to go with the individual, obviously, but I think you're right that there is this rich interaction between the two that you have to appreciate. I think I would put a little more weight on the individual, because no matter what the social context is, it doesn't necessarily lead to the individual changing. They could still be holding on, and so I think on the one hand, I could see the temptation to go to just work on the organizational level, because that's easier to change. You can just be like, oh, get rid of this structure, do this. Those are visible, tangible, quantifiable changes that are easy to make. So you'd be like, okay, everything's going to be great. Not realizing that no matter what, you still have these individuals who could be risk averse and have these tendencies to hold on to particular positions out of fear. And so, but nevertheless, if you just say, well, you go to your staff and be like, well, you all just need to overcome your fears, and you're still as domineering and
Mhm.
a jerk of a boss, that some individuals might have the courage to do so, but you're making it less, you're decreasing the probability that your staff will do so. So anyway, that's a way to say that I agree with you.
Yeah,
Although I would
I
give a little more weight to the individual than I would the social, but I think to deny the context is wrong as well.
yeah, I think to bring it back to something I say, I mean, I take your point. I think you said it well. Like, you can appear to be doing something by writing a policy and assuming that
Right.
that insight can be fundamentally improved by command and control decisions at the level of the institution, and it probably does
Manufacturing.
in some. Say again.
Oh, I was just saying it's like manufacturing insights.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's something that's observable. You can write the policy, you can change the structure, you can say we're going to do this practice, and so it is observable in that sense, but it's leaving out this something that's internal, subjective, and experience, and so that's just really hard to name, to document, and one of the reasons for that is because it's subjective, I think, and experiential. And so one of the things I draw this distinction in higher ed. There's an assumption that if you teach something to a college student that they learn it, and I'm like, this is obviously untrue.
Right.
I mean, what are you talking about? You can change the instruction and the pedagogy all you want, but ultimately, the student has to learn it, and those are different things. Um, and it's a myth that we can teach all the learning problems away. We can teach all the difficulties and challenges away. We can't do that. It's not possible. That's because that's not learning. The individual fundamentally has an agency. I think we all agree knowledge and skill is in the mind and nervous system of the individual. So what you do outside of that is going to be significantly limited, obviously. And so, but I think there's some desire to say, but no, all we have to do is just teach in a certain way, and then
Do
everybody's
you,
going to learn.
and I know we're getting slightly off topic here, but this is fascinating. Because it was such a great quote there, like the belief that you can teach all the learning problems away. I was like, wow, that's really powerful. And if you embrace that idea, or in the wrong way,
Mm.
can you be like, well, then I'll just throw
Doesn't matter
information.
what I do.
What's that? Yeah, it
It
doesn't
doesn't
matter
matter
what I
what I
do.
do as a teacher.
Yeah, yeah. Because you
I've
have
encountered
people.
that.
Yeah, it's probably not as prevalent, but I can see people just saying, well, if that's the case, it's really on them. I'll just, throw the information out there willy nilly and see what happens. Right. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, they're going to have to learn it by studying the textbook. What I do in class doesn't really matter.
Right.
That's an extreme statement and self-serving, and it
Yeah.
justifies not putting a lot of time into the act, and there's reasons for that. So yeah, I think that's a logical mistake. There's a very difference between saying I can't make you learn and nothing I do helps you learn. Those are not the same statements.
Right. 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 Well, it's so fascinating because, if I'm allowed a Kierkegaard reference,
Great.
so much of his thought and time was recognizing the fact that he could not change people's opinion. Like there's nothing I can do, because he was obviously so focused on the subjective, on the individual and their agency. And on top of that, their self-protective nature or inclination,
Mm-hmm.
and that we are living in these illusions that we will hold on to, with the tenacity of a lobster, right? So and then, like, what do you do in that, with that reality? And so he was trying to think of ways, well, how do I create circumstances that will engender, foster, increase the probability of you coming to doubt he felt that he needed to get you to doubt to become self-reflective. So, so he was not someone who just said, "Well, I guess it's pointless."
Mm-hmm.
He so much of his writing, especially earlier in his career, was on this what's called indirect communication, on creating doubt has helped people become self-reflective, and he felt that would break down the walls of illusions and of self-protection to get you to start on what he felt was to come to help you come to what he believed to be authentic Christianity. So interesting. So
Yeah, and there's just to pick up that thread as from a Buddhist point, that's kind of the idea of a koan or other riddles. Like, oh wait, do I understand how the world works? So interestingly, I think as I read Klein's final chapter, last couple chapters, and there's a point where he turns to say, well, how would you create or create conditions for people to make insights? How do you increase insights, right? I mean, that's a natural, and that's actually the impetus for the book, because he's presenting at conferences and he's going to core organizations and he says, hey, you all are focused so much on reduce, and he has a very simple little slide, reducing errors and reducing uncertainty. You're trying to explain away anomalies and contradictions and make everything coherent and cohesive, but you're not emphasizing increasing insights. And that's the source, that's a unique source of growth and improvement, and you're leaving it out. And then they say, wow, good point. You persuaded us. How do you increase insights? And he says, I don't know. So he then systematically at some point says, oh, I should probably try to figure this out. So the book does turn to what can an organization do to increase insights. But so one of the key things is he turns to this, he makes a point that you have to hold lightly core beliefs, that one of the main ways that you are obstructed from making an insight when it's sitting there, because he says, an insight is defined by the fact that somebody with the same data that you have makes the insight, but you don't, right? So it's not about having the information. He says people on the team, same team, have access to information, but one of them makes an insight and the others don't. Okay, so it's not about the information, right? That's kind of his argument. That's an oversimplified scenario. But so that's crucial, though. It's not in the data, it's in your engagement with it, your framing. And so then he gets to a point where he says, one of the things he uses this term anchoring beliefs. So we have these anchoring beliefs, they're a set of beliefs. They determine he doesn't use this word, I don't think, but mental set, our framing of the issue, and it constrains necessarily how we interpret it and understand it. And he says, a lot of times we hold too tightly to these anchoring beliefs. We're not flexible, open enough. We have a flitting sense that something doesn't quite right, but we ignore it, we diminish it for any number of reasons. And he says, hey, we got to loosen our grip on these anchoring beliefs. I think your story is that Kierkegaard went further. Well, how do you do that? Can you help people doubt those beliefs? I don't think he has other suggestions, but I don't think he has that one, to my knowledge. So that's interesting. I think Kierkegaard so there's an extra tool that Klein isn't mentioning in terms of how would you help promote insight making.
Well, I think it's kind of there because, and this is what a creative problem solving course starts with: this conflict, contradiction, which inherently is doubt of some sort. Because doubt is in that context is you have a perspective, and then you get this experience or data that doesn't cohere, that you can't fit it in, and so instead of saying, well, I'll reject the data, you're saying, oh, maybe my perspective is not comprehensive enough or adequate to subsume and understand this data. So then, and this is where I've mentioned Piaget, where people look at the cognitive jumps, and I know there's
stages of development.
People have disputed whether Piaget was even right, but there are these times where there are these even for that child, they have a perspective, they have a worldview, and that at some point becomes inadequate. They kind of intuit that there's something more out there, or that it's limited. And so something happens inside them to expand that, like we've talked about, object permanence. Initially, when you put a cloth over a toy or whatever, that it disappears because their worldview is simply what they can see in front of them. There's nothing around the corner. There's nothing behind that door. But at some point, they do come to see that there's this. They have a belief in object permanence, and that creates, like, it utterly expands their world. Because now, like, you want to crawl and cruise and walk and just explore and see what's around everything. But that transformation began with a certain amount of doubt and struggle and wrestling with a very limited worldview, but a kind of a need inside of them. So there's a lot of really interesting questions here that I know Loder wrestled with, Polanyi wrestled with. Like, one of the big ones that comes from Socrates is, how can you even sense or know a problem? I don't know, have you heard about that dilemma? Well, how would you even know you have a problem if you don't know the answer already? I didn't even think of that, so I should have done more. But there's this philosophical conundrum of, well, you can only know the problem if you know the solution intuitively already, or like, how would you even, from your perspective, how does a problem even arise? So Plato or Socrates can have that, like, because there is this tension, because our worldview is limited by kind of our earthly, worldly particular objects perspective, versus this world of eternal forms that we have deep inside us. And whenever we're like, how there's something more, it's based on this pull or this tension with our worldly view, and this need to get back to contemplating the world of or the eternal forms, which are, well, there's different understandings of what that is as you go through Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism, whatever. But so there's this, the tension or the doubt or the idea of problems and conflict come from, there's something inside us that there's like a bigger worldview out there, and our worldview is limited. And how do you reconcile that in a non-Platonic way? So I probably didn't explain that very well.
So what I take from that in relation to this is that it's not obvious, it's not automatic that people are even going to recognize that there is a problem, a discontinuity that needs to be bridged. It's not obvious that you'll see a contradiction, and that there's kind of maybe at least a couple levels. One is just and then maybe that's what he means by this kind of flitting sense that something isn't quite right, or incomplete, incoherent, there's a gap, and that's not totally rational and even conscious, and that we can't take for granted. Right? Some people they're not. That's not a problem. Like, they're not. What do you mean there's a problem? And the other person's like figuring it out. Like, well, wait a second, this thing doesn't match. But I think that may be a nuance, that even a moment in this process that I didn't pick up at him saying. Like, part of an insight is you have to recognize that there's a need for an insight or something, or you have to recognize at least that there's I think if I understood you correctly, there is a discontinuity that needs to be bridged, and then I think you've added that if you see that there's a problem, it implies that you recognize that there could be a resolution to the problem. Where there's incoherence, there must be possibility for coherence. Where there's discontinuity, there's possibility for continuity. Where there's cohesion isn't there of your system, well, there's a possibility for cohesion. That does seem like an existential dimension to this, that, not surprisingly, he's not getting it, which is exactly why I wanted to get your thoughts on this.
And there's been authors who have talked about this based on Polanyi's work, and others, like a guy named T.F. Torrance, who was a famous theologian from the 20th century, really emphasized this with Polanyi. And again, Polanyi was not a Christian. But certain Christians really latched on to Christian thinkers like T.F. Torrance, Jim Loder, really latched onto his thinking because they saw the relevance for a kind of a Christian cosmology, and the idea that that there is this fundamental belief in coherence and comprehension in the world, and it's not just like a formal belief. It's something that's it's like an existential need inside us. And I mean, like a really trivial example of that is we don't like suspense, or when we don't know something, we want resolution. That's feeding this deep need we have for a coherent worldview. I mean, I always talk about when I used to talk with students, I said, you'd rather know that you failed than that time before you don't know your grade.
So closure.
Closure, yeah, is a good way to
Often
put
it
it.
doesn't feel good, but it's
Yeah,
better to have closure than to have the open loop, even if that would give you some hope or
right.
something. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So, which is something actually Kierkegaard explored in a book called Concept of Anxiety, but that's a discussion for another day.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I mean, well, what's interesting, and I'll just throw this out there and we can move on. But then the question is, if you don't have this Platonic belief in that we are these beings who fell from contemplating the eternal forms into these worldly bodies, and then went through a kind of a quasi amnesia. So we have these insights become just a remembrance, a recollection of the eternal forms. Then the question is, how does that world get into us such that our perspectives and growth in comprehension are coming more and more to that fundamental belief of coherence and comprehension? Does that make sense?
I'm latching onto the phrase, how does that set of beliefs get into us?
Get into us, and so that
Yeah.
like it could just be something that's wired into us, however, evolution, design, whatever. But there's this, well, how does the world get in there? And this is where, I mean, Loder talked about how like the oral phase, like children, like when they're putting stuff in their mouth, that's part of their brains processing and getting the world inside themselves, which I thought was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But and does that just grow? Okay, so this is, I could be wrong here, but I haven't read much of Klein. I did read a book review just to prepare, given the time we had, and it was interesting how he was talking about the need to become more cosmopolitan, like to go out and
Mm.
experience more of the world through music, art, recreation, whatever, just getting more of the world and experience of the world inside you. That creates this repository from which your I would say your tacit dimension is
Right.
putting it all together into a comprehensive worldview. So it's kind of similar to that oral phase of the child who's taking the world and getting in as their brains can process it, which is just through feel and touch, through more formal ways of doing that.
So
So
one simplification, I think, of what you're saying is in relation to Klein is he says, okay, there are these beliefs, these core beliefs, a set of beliefs that really are the hinge. They're determinative of both of our ability to make insights and our obstacles to doing that, because the beliefs both get in the way, right? But also can allow us to make an insight. Is that fair to say? Or at least beliefs have this crucial role and psychologically, because the belief is a psychological construct, I would say, that it's kind of the intermediary. The beliefs lead to expectations, beliefs lead to interpretations,
yeah,
beliefs lead to thoughts. I would say they're not the same thing, but they are, because they're more durable, they're kind of internalized. We can gain awareness of our thoughts. We're not always, as human beings, we can't always gain awareness of our beliefs. Point I made in the procrastination course, we can actually have beliefs that we don't actually agree to. So we can have internalized through, I would say, through the process of socialization, some belief like my worth is equivalent to my performance. Most people, they can say, I kind of do act as if I believe that, but when you ask me that, I don't think I believe that.
hmm,
And so I think this is a sign that this, whatever this thing is, beliefs, value, and psychologists, Kurt Lewin especially, or at least started this as like this field of And you like field theory, a field of beliefs, this kind of task, so this, and they're often tacit, they're not always, and that this is the wellspring that's hard to get a hold of, that is the basis for lot is expressed in lots of actions and thoughts and all kinds of things. So I think, so I think I heard your question is, where do these come from? Or at least one part of your question is, where do these come from? So my framework, reinforced in Buddhism, at least my reading of it, but really comes from my study in psychology, is, and I'm going to say that, okay, there's a biological dimension. The human organism has a structure, the human brain, and to a certain extent the mind, right? So one classic example is like causality. We have an idea of causality but it's not complete and undeveloped. So this idea of object permanence is kind of causality, depends how you understand that. Our understanding of causality developing in relation to our experiences. At some point we say, wait, the world doesn't work where things just disappear. Right? There must be a definite, it's behind that thing. I mean, that's obviously an oversimplification. So there's a kind of biological, but then, belief clearly has a cognitive dimension, it has a content that comes from our experience in the world, right? So people in different cultures believe different things. So like that's kind of a pretty good sign that it's not purely coming out of our biological, and then individuals within a community and culture have different too. So for mine, it's got, okay, where's the biological dimensions? We are biological creatures. We are psychological creatures. A lot going on internally within the subject and the experience. But a lot of the content of that is coming from our community. Language, concepts come from particular interactions, right? So I think in English, we have certain concepts. We don't have other concepts. I think this clearly matters. So one way I put it, to try to be as pithy as possible, as I say, we are biologically determined to be culturally determined. So we are organisms that are meant to be part of communities. That's what gives human beings their adaptive advantage, is that we can learn from our communities, and that we learn from specific communities. We don't learn all languages. We learn the one that we are immersed in.
Right.
We don't learn all concepts. We learn the ones we work with. We learn through terminology and language. And so we have to, from my point of view, you have to account for all that complexity. But so that last point might sound like, oh, well, you're just saying that people are just socialized. But that brings back to the point we were talking before. No, individuals, the psychology has more power, right? It's not that we're only designed to interact with our community and learn it. But the individual still has agency and autonomy. You can decide, I don't want to be influenced by my community. Obviously, people are constantly challenging their environments and their communities and their culture and their belief systems that are prevalent. Well, let's just take that as a fact. So we're not only creatures that are socialized, right? But I would say, from kind of a evolutionary point of view, you can't have a capacity that you don't have. Like, if people are learning from their community, doesn't just happen. That has to be a feature, right? We have to be designed to do that. So, our dogs are learning some things about being in our homes and in our communities, but they're not learning a bunch of other things, right? It's not just about being exposed to it, right? And the things they can learn and do learn are specific to them as an organism. And the things we learn and gain are somewhat, to a certain extent, specific to us. Like, we can't, does that make sense? I don't want to get too abstract, but, human faculties are coupled with their environment, including their social environment. But that is not an absolute description of what one could learn, right? So dogs do learn things and are aware of things in our human world that we're not aware of, right? So dogs are used to identify when people are going to have seizures. They sense earthquake. I mean, they do all kinds of, okay, wait a second. It's not that we understand everything and they understand less. It's that we understand different things than they do. We notice, where we perceive, we conceive of different things. And in any case, but this is the point of that digression, is to say, I think all of these things influence the beliefs of an individual. My biology, my psychology, and my social, and then none of them are determinative. And it's not just a reaction, right? It's not just that because I live in this community, I believe this thing. Well, this is obviously not true. But it's also true that a lot of people do. So how do we reconcile this fact? So the power of the group, the community operating on individuals isn't just because of individuals, the psychology and the sociology, it's the biology. We can't internalize beliefs unless there was some mechanism in the human body that allowed us to do that. And so, but that's a structure. That's the thing we come to the world with.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So can I? So I'm just
Yeah.
going to put out a. I thought it'd be interesting because this is somewhat abstract, and so like, how
Yeah.
do we kind of make it a bit more concrete?
Yeah.
Um,
I can do
so
that too.
So I'm just going to create a hypothetical community that tends to be racist in their certain views of an outside group. And you have two individuals in there, and one comes to see that that these racist views of the others are this other community are wrong. That are well, there could be okay. There could be ways they go about two, like, so let's say we have two brothers in this community. One fully accepts the racist views or the views demeaning this other community, and the other one says no, like there's like they did accept it, but at some point they begin to doubt them. And because there is some interaction between the two communities. So are we saying, like, okay, the one case, the racist views are based on certain beliefs about this other community. They have to be something. There's all these ways in which they are less than this community. They're not as smart. They're Philistine in their cultural practices and whatever. All these ways to demean them, to make them less. And the one brother holds that despite interactions and ways in which that obviously is not the case, where the other brother says, wait a minute, I they seem to be just as intelligent. They just, their cultural practices are just different. They're not less than. Um, so what so beyond that, they end up holding different beliefs. Like, one just says, kind of rejects the racist community. There's something going on in each side inside of them as well, right? I don't know if this is a good example. I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah. I think it's a good example. So I think from a Buddhist point of view, and I think of where Buddhism is converging with contemporary psychology, there's some sociology and some concepts that are used actually to explain or to critique a kind of racist view. So Buddhists would say human beings have an inclination, a tendency, a habitual pattern to essentialize. You act this way, you are that thing. So that's to essentialize, to say there are these unchanging essences that describe you, and then that's a use. So that kind of gets manifest in terms of labeling, maybe picking some particular feature and then saying that defines you, and me. And that essentializing leads to a kind of reification. We turn that hypothesized or imputed essence into a thing. We reify, and then we say that is a thing. That's a real thing. It's like an object. It's a mental object, but it's real. It's not a construct that I've used out of convenience or unknowingly or unwittingly. And so the Buddhist view is that the human organism does that. That's what we are inclined to do. It's not that we only do that, but we do that. That's what our organism. So we're designed. So the second half of my view of human beings are biologically determined to be culturally determined is another way to put that is human beings, the human organism is designed to make beliefs. We create beliefs. That's what we do. Then we are designed to believe our beliefs. That's what, for the most part, people do. Now, that doesn't mean we can't do something else, but that is the tendency, the inclination, the thing that people do psychologically. So certain schools in Buddhism, the Yogacara school, sometimes called the mind only. I'm currently reading a book about this, saying, okay, we have these inclinations. Now, coupled with some other human creations, language, thought. Well, thoughts often, and concepts in particular. So concepts are generalizations. We create this category. Language is kind of relies on that in a lot of cases, right? A word, a term, a label. But if we think about it, these are one way to think about that is that's frequently taking a bunch of variety of things. Actually, I say the word tree, or chair. And that, and so this is a critique of language. Wittgenstein made this, Saussure made this, that what exactly is a tree? Or a chair? Any linguistic feature cannot capture that. But we all kind of have this concept. And so what we're doing is we're kind of simplifying, we're rounding the edges, we're creating a bucket and putting things in it, and it's useful and it has this value. But at some point we've constructed a bucket, and that is powerful, useful. We have a unaware, unconscious inclination to do that. But how accurate, how's that map onto reality? And I think we'd say incompletely, simplistically. At least that's what philosophers of language have said. Some have said. And so when you combine the human inclination, I think that is even beyond language to reify and essentialize. And it's adaptive. It's like, well, if everything I encounter is new and sui generis, then how do I process the world? That's not very useful. And could be counterproductive. And then language itself, the way that language works, can reinforce that too. So if this is kind of the argument. So the racist framework is based on a kind of essentialization.
Mm-hmm.
That defines your essence, and that is largely unchanging and fixed and explanatory. And so, you might see the connection to kind of Buddhism talking, well, no, actually the world is in flux and it's constantly changing, and our unhappiness and our being thwarted and the pain we inflict on other people is actually due to an artificially holding on to and being attached to and fixed in a changing world with our self-concept or things we want, or our desires. And that this is deeply, you can describe it in those terms, but the Yogacara school and others are saying, but why is that? And so they come up and their analyses, 2,000 years ago and into the present, were basically what I gave you now. Now, the words I use to describe that comes from contemporary psychology, reification, sociology, essentialization, the 20th century analysis of language, but they actually converge on very similar points. Not to say that that's the only theory in philosophy of language. With Wittgenstein's is not the only theory, and people disagree. But so that would be an account, right, of what you just said in terms of the biology. Human organisms come with a tendency to reify and essentialize. Human organisms have the capacity for language and creating concepts. The social world we live in both requires that we do that and reinforces that. Right? The more we see it and use it, it becomes more solid. So the reification becomes solid, and then we could become attached to it. We want to believe that it serves some purpose for us at a psychological level, social levels, to my benefit to believe such things. So that, I don't know, I'm not sure how persuasive that account is, but it's an account using the three buckets or frameworks that I kind of started with.
Yeah, I think how I would approach it meshes with that. I would just say that, this is where I'm fundamentally like, okay, what are we all about, and about all the time? And I was writing about this yesterday, that one of the great insights Kierkegaard had for me was in this book called Sickness Unto Death, and he talked about self-relationality. And what people don't often pick up on that is what he's saying is, okay, we are creatures who are always seeking meaning, purpose, fulfillment, self-worth, so on and so forth. But we are bound by that pursuit. We never can step out of it. It informs every decision we make. And so as you're growing up, you are in that struggle. And so you're in a social context. Well, it's very, they are giving you, they are inculcating you. They are saying, well, here's kind of how we packaged the world for you. And so it doesn't have to be the case, but it's natural to accept that, imbibe it, and make it your own. And that serves the purpose of, one, helping you understand the world, but also helps you become a member of that group and have meaning and purpose in that group, which is very natural. I don't think it's right to do that, but that's very natural.
Yeah.
And so you just accept these beliefs. Like, I mean, to my shame, back, and this is probably when you were there, like growing up, Polish jokes were the thing. I don't know if you remember that. I don't know if that was
Sure. My
like,
dad used to tell him, who's Polish, used to tell him all the time.
yeah. And so, you know, and it's like, why would we picking on the Polish people? But that was just something you did, and it unquestioningly did.
Yeah.
And it just took some time for people to say, this is wrong, stop doing it. And you go, oh yeah, you're right, sorry. So you don't do that anymore, thankfully. Um, I mean, that was, I don't know, it was like 70s or 80s. It seemed like that was just the thing you did. I don't know
I'm sure
where
there are
that
books written about him.
yeah, I don't know where that derived from it, but that's another time.
No, I
Anyway,
can tell you, but we can get
okay.
back to that.
Anyway, so you kind of accept this, and then now, and there's reasons to stop doing that, to like, because you could jump to this other social community that doesn't accept that belief, and so you just accept that belief, but you've never critically examined you just foregone one, or just let go of one set of beliefs for another set of beliefs just to be part of a community. So it could be somewhat unexamined.
That's right.
But to go back to these brothers, you know, on the one hand, um, I want to be part of this community, but I also, part of what makes me feel better about myself is the competition, or by comparison to other people. So I want others to be less than me. And this is a very natural tendency, like, hey, this person did great. Well, yeah, they did great, but did you notice this? You can be very critical. You can kind of like chip away so that they somehow, their status gets is diminished compared to you. So that's those kind of core, those that tendency to carve out your sense of meaning, purpose, often is at the expense of others or dependent on others.
Right.
And so, but then the question is, and so you, in that, if that becomes so, if you're so dependent on that, then you will reject obvious data that contradicts your opinion. And that can not just be about racist views, but like, look at scientists who will hold on to their beliefs tenaciously just because they've invested in it, it's part of their self-worth, and so they can't even hear, or they will denounce
Yeah.
another opinion to just because they need to have their own position. I mean, there I won't go into I know an institution where these fights between two theologians that was just, I mean, it was pathetic and sad and ridiculous, but they fought tooth and nail. And at some point, you're like, your theologians, like, this is like, it was kind of ridiculous from the outside, but they were so invested in their particular beliefs. And again, it wasn't just because they were so passionate about beliefs. It was, from my perspective, because there was something about themselves that was their
At
investment.
stake, on the line.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there was at stake. Yeah. So anyway, so what can overcome that is the disposition to, like, and this is Socrates was like this, and Kierkegaard adopted it, was the worst thing in the world would be to live a lie, to live a life in illusion. So how do you, so you, someone who's like that, who has that disposition to say, I I'm going to be open and always challenge my beliefs because I want it to be true. So what that doesn't mean is you're kind of like this, you're kind of indifferent about your beliefs out there. You can be passionate about your beliefs, but you're always challenging them versus being passionate about beliefs and protecting them. I think that's a different different disposition.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think someone like this brother who is willing to accept the data that the people are just different, they're just as smart or whatever, that's a disposition where there's an openness to being challenged, and that takes, and it's not just a disposition, it just doesn't happen. There has to be something inside you that says, no, I want to, um, I want to know the truth, even when it's really really hard. It could be lonely. It can lead to um, a lot of like internal wrestling and restlessness, but it's worth it because again, you just can't live in a lie or perpetuate a lie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyway, I know it's slightly different. I don't know if that our two
Well,
perspectives
I would just pick up
overlap.
the thread,
Yeah.
whether it's continuous with what we've been talking about in Gary Klein.
Right.
I don't know, but so I think from the Buddhist perspective, there's a strong belief in the human capacity to develop what's called upaya or skillful means. So the tendency you described of comparison, competition as the basis sometimes of one's own maintenance of and sustenance of their self-concept and their position and their sense of worth, and that this is a corrosive inclination of human beings to do that. So Kierkegaard says this can manifest. So the Buddhist position is it's built into a lot of their approaches that human beings can develop through meditation, and this is actually really, as far as I understand, really crucial to the idea of karma. That if you can act not volitionally, that it's possible to get to a state where you're not driven by willful choices that are in your self-interest. That it's possible to get to that state. And you can see there's various ways that this is reflected in different methods and different ways of thinking. So one angle is it's very much connected to accurate view of reality. I think truth is what you were just talking about. Some people talk about that. I think the angle that I use is wisdom, and wisdom's a little bit different than an understanding of truth. But it's manifest in a kind of toolkit of how to be happier and a good Buddhist, so to speak. It's called the Four Immeasurables. And it's these sort of attitudes, these ways of being in the world. And there are two that are designed specifically, you want to inhabit yourself. So you want to fill your mind and your body with these two ways of approaching the world. One is with compassion. So you're not seeing other people's ignorance as uplifting you. You feel sorry for them. And you empathize. It's not empathy, it's compassion in the sense that, and it's a recognition that not that they're not smart, but they're ignorant, or they're being driven by these unhelpful motives. And oh wow, yeah, you're suffering.
Yeah.
If you're out of sync with reality, if you're doing mean, bad things to me or to yourself or to others, you are suffering. And I can be empathetic to your suffering. Versus, which is a little bit different than being judgmental or saying, "Oh, I'm not doing that, so I feel good," right? So I'm compassionate. A second is this idea of sympathetic joy. The opposite of Schadenfreude is that if I want to be happier in the world, be happy when other people are happy because they're happy, right? So if they're succeeding, so it's the opposite of envy or jealousy, right? And that we can cultivate this. So these are two of these four immeasurables, these four mental and emotional states we want to put ourselves in as we engage with the world. So I think they're directly related to what you're saying, right? Like we have a human tendency to want to feel better by lifting and make ourselves up by pushing other people down, or by saying, well, there's something wrong with you and that's bad for you, bad on you, so I feel better. Yeah. And I think both of these are trying to say they're actually articulated because those other tendencies I just mentioned are so common, so prevalent, but they're not inevitable, right? With skillful means, I can either recognize, hey, I'm being kind of a jerk to that person, judging them, and I can in the moment intervene and change my thinking and my feeling and my emotions. And there's a belief among Buddhists that you can fundamentally change not just your state in any given moment, but if you do that enough and you deeply internalize this view, you can then change your very capacity, your way of going in the world is to be more compassionate, more empathic, more joyful, greater harmony, because you're changing your beliefs. You're actually changing your beliefs, not just your state.
Right.
Um,
Well, I would say that this is where I like talking, because I feel like Buddhism and contemplative Christianity, they walk such similar paths, and again,
mhm,
they diverge. I mean, I think we have to respect the differences and where they
mhm,
end up. Because from a contemplative Christian, I think for Buddhism and Christianity, it's like, well, our selves, these constructs of ourself, is what really gets in the way. Uh,
mhm,
so, like from for contemplative Christians, the need for self assertion, be it to put others down or just it's a way of saying I'm alive, I have meaning, I have purpose, I'm alive, and we do this in ways that are really ultimately deleterious to ourselves because it's self protection, and it's a way to push against the void and nothingness that we've talked about previously. But and so the way that contemplative Christians, and it's really in the Bible too, is this idea of dying to yourself, that you are letting go of your self-will and that need for self-protection, all that you're yielding so that you can really come into the presence of God and really enjoy his love and passion, and that becomes your good. And from that, um, you are actually thrust more deeply and more truthfully into the world, because then I don't need to see others in ways that are distorted from my own means. I can see them truthfully, so I can be
mhm,
sympathetic, empathetic, as you mentioned. Um, but that's born out of this, it, it it's because you're the deepest need we have for meaning and purpose is being satisfied through God's presence alone. And so then you don't need that. You don't need to find it in the things of this world. So anyway,
mhm.
are we still on insights? I feel like we've
Well,
we
let me come back to that.
let's get
So
back.
there is some insights, a word that I think is probably pretty significant contemplative Christianity
Yeah,
and
yeah,
mystical. And I think we're using it. That's maybe a little bit somewhat different meaning than this one, and certainly is a huge concept in Buddhism. And then if you've ever heard of Vipassana, that's sometimes called
yeah.
insight meditation.
Yeah.
So it's gaining an awareness, a true and accurate understanding of the nature of reality by virtue of examining one's own experience. I think that's so I think so. I think that we might try to link it together and say, well, and I think we look at our own journeys that there's some unique kind of knowledge that comes from an examination of your own individual experience in relation to the world, it's not that somebody told you, maybe they told you some things, but that knowing is different than an insightful knowing. That is qualitatively different. I know the words, I heard it, I understood it, I can give you an explanation. That is different somehow than an embodied knowledge that comes, I think, often from inside. Not only, but somehow mining your own experience
Hmm.
is different than mining a textbook or research. There's just something different about it for the organism, for human beings. Um, so I and that I don't I didn't read every word of the book. I may have missed this, but I think that's an element of insight that he's not talking about that we might emphasize, that there's a royal road to knowledge that comes from one's own experience, and that's a qualitatively different kind of knowledge. And I would and so I think there's a lot of convergence here. And I just want to say one thing, to the extent that we're putting Christianity and Buddhism in relation to one another. So just my limitations. But I might call myself, I don't usually call myself a Buddhist, but I turn to Buddhist philosophy and psychology, not as a religion. But there are people who do. And I think that view of Buddhism might converge more closely with a Christian view on some of these matters. Does
Mhm.
that make sense? So just to be clear, my flavor of,
Right.
so if just anybody listening who wants to look at the confluence or examine that, just to recognize, I want to locate myself. I'm not approaching Buddhism as a religion.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So, I mean, one thing I was
Yeah.
going to say, and I think it's easy to take, because you and I tend to, even though you don't look at Buddhism as a religion and you're looking at it through a particular lens, and here I come with my contemplative Christianity. I think in the end, what we're saying is these aren't two separate realms. Um, and it's like we can't put like religion or just kind of this
I
existential
agree.
stuff off to the side, and then okay, let's talk about insights for business. I think that what we're saying is that we are these individuals who are have these interior experiences that we have to be sensitive to, and because they always, like we said with Kierkegaard, we're self-relational creatures. So no matter what we're doing, be it church Sunday or synagogue, Saturday evening, or in the lab, those are, in a way, they're all existential spiritual experiences that we're having because they're wrapped up with our quest for meaning, purpose, fulfillment, and self-worth. So, and those are informing how what we're all about. From, are we creatures who have such a fundamental need for truth and not living a lie, which is an existential posture that makes us more receptive to looking at data. I don't know if objectively is the right word, but more in a way that's receives them and rejects others that don't, cohere with our present worldview. That's a really that's an existential position. And I think person that we haven't really talked about much, but who really captures this way of viewing the world is not bifurcated into these different experiences is Simone Weil. I think we've
Hmm.
talked about her. She has this very famous essay called it's like school studies as a preparation for prayer or something like that.
Yeah,
It's
you shared that
no,
with me once.
yeah, it's very influential to Iris Murdoch and others later philosophers. And she's talking about school studies and how we're yielding ourselves. And the example that she gives is like, 2 + 2 = 5 is very subjective. That's all you. 2 + 2 = 4 is a way of yielding yourself to a greater reality. So I don't know. I know next week we're probably going to talk about mysticism more directly, but we might want to, talk more about Simone Weil, who was a mystic. She had a number of mystical experiences that informed her work. Um, all that's to say, like, I think the idea of insights and the creative problem solving, which I think is a way of looking at how we come about having insights. Um, it doesn't mean you have to be a contemplative Christian or adopt
No.
Buddhism the other way. It's just saying it's just trying to help us grasp the human experience. And
Yes.
there's a lot of these insights that are present. Um, and so someone like Michael Polanyi, who was an atheist but was very greatly appreciated by uh, Christians, he was really trying to tap into the human experience. So that's why he talked about the tacit dimension and whatnot, because he was fighting against kind of Marx's views of science, which was more abstract, deterministic, and really did not appreciate the individual experience. And I think that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so
Let me pick up that thread. I think that's exactly right. That insight, if you examine insight carefully, then you put a lens on the individual, and specifically individual human subjective experiential experience. And that leads us then to ask existential questions too.
right,
And there's a lot of methods. So if I'm putting, going back to where I kind of opened this, if I'm saying, what is the average of 100 college students on this? That is a very different question. than how does an individual with expertise make an insight, and that the former can only say so much about the latter.
Right.
And so if we value the individual, truly value the individual, and then say what makes them up and how do they do it, and then you recognize that limitation. And then also if you say, well, there really are individuals, not just American or men or white, whatever, then you take that seriously, and you take seriously that agency and autonomy and authenticity and this sense of self, then I think, that if those arise or be more prominent in your worldview, then you just ask different questions. You think differently. I think the world looks more complicated,
Mm.
but also looks more beautiful. Also I'll end with this, like I feel because I'm often reading and thinking about these things through the lens of the students that I work with. I think they want to be unique by being better than other people in what everybody does.
Right.
And I'm like, no, be special by being more you.
Right.
Another way and then there's a metaphor is like, if there's a lot of snow out here at the moment, if every snowflake is different, which supposedly is the case according to scientists, then surely every human being is different.
Right.
And it's not about being better at other people in these things that are socially valued. And I don't think that's the route to fulfillment and meaning and harmony, self-harmony, a kind of self-coherence. I think it's about embracing that and then seeing where that takes you.
Yeah, I just to end, I was thinking, just the individual and communal and corporate want for conformity. That we like it when people are a certain way, and that serves our interests. So yeah, conformity. But on the flip side, there's people who are just so open to everything that I find that just as like everything's great. I'm like, well, no, not everything's great. You think you're being, just kind of ecumenical and whatever. And I'm like, that's actually, it's just another, I kind of feel like it's another form of conformity. It's just another group that's like, oh, let's be open to everything. And I feel like the people who are really, creating useful I don't want to make it utilitarian, but insights that are really um, um, generative for the individual and for society are people
Transformative.
What's that? Informative.
Transformative. Yeah.
Transformative. That's good. They're people who have very strong beliefs. That they are really pursuing truth, and they are not going to just accept anything or be open to everything. They're very passionate, and it's not a like the kind of indifference. They are really passionate, and those people are really interested because they're going to dive into things. They're going to wrestle with it and really think about it. I mean, I don't want to put myself up as an example, but here I am. I've been studying Kierkegaard for decades, right? And I study him because I think he has insights, but I'm open to him being wrong. So I hold him loosely, but I find him very insightful, and I read him over and over again because there's so much to uncover. So I'm very, very passionate about my Kierkegaard research. But if someone shows me something that I didn't see, I want to be open to that because I'm pursuing truth. I'm not pursuing Kierkegaard, like as a cult-like figure that I have to just embrace uncritically. But I'm very passionate about Kierkegaard because I really think he's got made insight or lane into truth that others missed. I don't know if that makes sense. I just it's not like, oh, you can be this way or be that way. You're not wishy-washy. You're really people who do make insights. I think are experts, are folks who are just they don't want to live that lie, and they're passionate about that, and so they will study stuff but always be open to new information that could challenge them because they want part of knowing the truth is being challenged by different beliefs, and then
Yeah.
saying, oh no, I think I'm right, or oh yeah, I think you are right. I don't know. Anyway,
Well, let me give
go
oh, go ahead.
ahead. Oh, I just get
Finish.
deeper insights. So I don't want people to walk away like, oh, I got to be, open to everything. It's like, well, it's sort of in a way, but it's allowing the pursuit of truth to kind of show you where to go, and it's a life of passion and commitment. It's not indifference and kind of a lazy approach to life, not at all. But I think that the importance is, and that I really like the idea of like, in the creative problem solving course, one of the things we talked about is, being open, having new experiences, open yourself up to more and more of what's out there, be it, doing new things, trying new food, whatever, like that seems trivial, but I just, just having a life that's open to counter perspectives. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know if you wanted to end on something or.
Well, let me bring it back to a quote that I'm looking at as I have the book open, because if I take the essence of your point, so Klein says on page 244, organizations may need to keep in check their desires for predictability and perfection, not hold beliefs, not pretend they don't have knowledge. He's not saying that. So what is it? And I think he's saying, well, the desire for predictability and perfection obscures or constrains openness.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not the knowledge or the beliefs, it's it's more like motivation, a desire, right? A need that is the organizations have, and I would say that individuals have, for predictability and perfection. And why? Often to get affirmation, acceptance, safer. And so I think that, and it's not about never believing anything, because the anchor beliefs, the core beliefs, are crucial to the insights, to making insights.
Yep, I agree.
All right. Hopefully that brought a kind of cohesion to our conversation. Back to Klein and giving him more or less the last word.
Yeah, that was good. Excellent. All right. Well, another great discussion, Nick. Okay, so next week we are going to be doing a little bit more on mysticism, which I'm really that's exciting. I'm looking forward to. I got to go back and read some more Simone Weil and some other things this week to prepare. But until then,
thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Look forward to it.